As promised in my previous video, I'll be doing another response to Rage After Storm. My first one was to her video on why we should enforce traditionalism. This one is on her race realism video. An interesting development has happened in that time. After getting backlash, even from her own side, on her white nationalist propaganda, she has for some reason decided to nuke her whole channel. So I won't be able to link her original video or her channel. However, she has appeared on Virtue of the West, an alt-right podcast hosted by another person I responded to. I'll link to that instead so you can get even more of an idea of what kind of person she is. Now with that out of the way, let's get on to the video.
So, after many of you have speculated about my stance on race, especially my recent one, I've decided to make a video about it. Because heck, I love talking about things that will probably get me kicked off YouTube and every other social media website.
Prophetic words. We already knew your stance on race, and now you're just being more honest about it. But you did accurately predict, even jokingly, you'd push things too far. Glad to see that your repugnant, loathsome views and self-righteous crusade against people of color has finally caught up to you. It's hilarious how a little backlash causes alt-right snowflakes to melt.
Racism, it's an interesting lexeme. I remember being first taught about it when I was a wee little kid, and we were talking about the slave trade, you know, in Africa and all that other shit. So at the time, I only saw racism as a thing that white people did to black people. Despite the fact that I as a kid was racially profiled for being German, for example, I got called a Nazi on the playground, etc., I never actually assumed that that was a case of racism. I just thought, heck, that's just people being assholes, right?
And little you was right. It wasn't racism. At most, it was prejudice and discrimination. You're a perfect example of how inchoate ideas can be malformed by alt-right propaganda, peddled by charlatans looking for a quick buck, and you served as the perfect customer, happily gobbling up their lies. But I have my doubts about the authenticity of the story. You grew up in Germany, and you were called a Nazi in your own country as a common occurrence? I call bullshit.
Which leads me to think, despite having known what racism was, I still wasn't able to put A and B together. Which then gives me another question to whether or not the term racism actually properly exists. Racism is a made-up word. Well, heck, every word is a made-up word.
Wow. Not even going for the racism against white people approach that Brittany Pettibone went for. Just going for the no such thing as racism. What next? Are you going to try and justify treating other people like shit?
We use words to explain new things that we describe to often make our lives a heck of a lot easier. And then we use those words to accuse people of things to help our own selfish narrative of getting our point across.
You know how there's this prevalent stereotype of anti-SJWs not giving a fuck about anyone but themselves and their own myopic worldview? You're one of the truest examples of that stereotype I've seen.
The same goes with transphobia, Islamophobia, and many other words that are used for fear-mongering. And words like these all lie under the same hood. They are used to force people to ignore why we might feel uneasy about people that look or are a little bit different. And notice how these words were mostly created by minorities or people who felt oppressed. These words gave people power that would inevitably cause other people a retraction of rights.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.
For example, when we speak of racism, the overuse of the word has allowed affirmative action to be implemented in our society. Or when we use the word sexism, the use of that word has allowed women to gain more custody rights, despite the fact that they probably have been terrible mothers or triggered a divorce for no reason.
What? You actually believe that affirmative action is because of what you anti-SJWs define as overusing the word racist? It couldn't possibly have anything to do with the fact that people of color are more likely to be discriminated against, can it? No, it's obviously because someone got called a racist when they felt it wasn't deserved. And you think women getting preferential treatment in custody battles is a new thing? No, it's not because of feminism. It's because of the traditionalism you love so much. You just used a men's rights talking point while supporting a mindset that many men's rights activists say they're not a fan of. So let me get this straight. Women shouldn't get preferential custody treatment, but they should because they are more nurturing?
Do you even listen to yourself when you talk?
I drift in and out.
Obviously, I wouldn't deny that any type of racism is still prevalent in our society, but that's not really my point. My point is, why do we need to use the word racism to describe the development of African or some Middle Eastern countries?
Because that's exactly what caused the colonialism that led to the poor development of these countries over the past couple of centuries, and their continued struggles. The white man pillaged the resources and subjugated, if not genocided, the people, and now has the gall to wonder why things are tough in those countries.
Let's look at the continent of Africa, for example.
Interesting that you mentioned the Middle East before, but are now shying away from it because you know every reliable source down to a history book for grade schoolers would state that India and the Middle East were civilized nations just a few centuries ago, and it was the white Europeans who were the barbarian invaders. The scientific developments that most of Europe left behind in the Dark Ages were being continued in the land of people you fear the most.
What we're told as wee little youngsters is that the white man has caused every single issue that exists in Africa, and that we are the reason that they are not developed. Could you believe it? Some people actually still think that Africa would look like this if the white man wouldn't have interfered.
Nobody says that the white man is the sole cause for these problems, but it's undeniable what kinds of effects colonialism has had. It took different ethnic groups and divided them among arbitrary lines into white man-created nations, forcing groups to live together that have a long history of conflict while dividing the groups themselves. Let's not forget how many resources that Europeans have pillaged from these places. Look at the pyramids in Egypt, for example. Countless goods stolen. Once again, look at the effects being a conquered nation had on other countries, even in Europe. Poland and many other Eastern European nations have long been subjected to this, and some are still categorized as developing nations to this date. It did not truly industrialize until well into the 20th century.
But what we weren't told as wee little youngsters is that Africans were enslaving, killing, and raping people long before the white man arrived.
And Europeans were doing this to each other for millennia, and sub-Saharan Africans have been traded in the slave trade route dating back to antiquity. What's your point?
Despite the aggression probably increasing due to slavery, the white man still did a lot of good things for Africa. Fun story. During the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans could not penetrate into Africa for very long or very far due to the threat of malaria and other tropical diseases. The sailing ships were on a timetable to catch the best winds for the year. They would buy their slaves from blacks on offshore islands. Then they took off before the hurricane season. Blacks were completely complicit in the slave trade and actually benefited from it.
More right-wing Tea Party propaganda. While there was some slave trade by Africans selling other Africans, the overwhelming majority of it involved capturing free blacks. And even if we granted the white nationalist bullshit narrative is true, it would still stand to reason that a vast majority of black people did not benefit from this. The instances where this actually happened are not an indictment of people with more melanin in their skin, but of capitalism.
For the Americans and Europeans' involvement in it, the slave trade would have not occurred without the black people's permission, including their involvement and approval. Besides, we do forget that it was whites who largely ended slavery.
Do you even do research? Seriously, do you? Sorry, but Rents and Daily Stormer don't count. I know you backpedaled and claimed just a joke, bro, with a Stormfront news site, but you're clearly reading off cue cards here. Do you really believe that Africans would not have been captured if not for permission from warlords? What do you think happened with the enslaved Native Americans? As for your claim of it being whites who largely ended the slave trade, they wouldn't have ended it had enslaved Africans not gotten involved with the abolition. And if you don't believe me, in the description of this video, you will find a PDF link to Equiano's autobiography. It helped play a role in the abolition of the slave trade in 1807.
Another fun fact. Arab slave traders had actually enslaved more people than the European slave traders did. Blacks had rounded up one another and sold each other to the Arab slave traders too. Not to mention, us Europeans were also enslaved by the Arabs.
Europeans were the ones who made a large industry out of slavery, and the effects of this are still being felt. As I had previously elucidated to Brittany Pettibone, there are people alive today who knew people that were slaves.
Where's our affirmative action? Oh right, white people are fucking terrible, I forgot.
Do white nationalists ever stop playing the victim long enough to realize that maybe, just maybe, the ridiculous things you say born from your propaganda mills might be completely not based in any reality outside of your little bubble? I would ask you to use your gray matter, except you've made it abundantly clear that in between your ears lies not gray matter, but brown matter, which has had the effect of redirecting the source of your speech to the origin of said brown matter. And the pungent aroma of your propaganda wafts all over the internet, with its disgusting stench being inflicted upon anyone unfortunate enough to discover it.
Even though it was the British Empire that first abolished the slave trade, losing a heck of a lot of money and lives in the process, But okay. But meh, white men. But white men people still ruined Africa. Actually, when the European Empire stepped away from Africa, Africa practically went down the shitter.
Sure, let's give Europeans credit for leaving the room after making such a mess of everything. A child tears up the wallpaper, smashes the windows, breaks all the toys, rips open the pillow, busts the ceiling light, pees all over the carpet, breaks the lamp, and jumps on the bed until the frame collapses, and now you want to reward it for leaving the room when it could have done more damage? I take it you know nothing about the Kingdom of Nigeria from the 16th century, which had nothing to do with European whites as it was before colonialism, or the empires of Kush or Aksum. You're probably going to claim they were blonde, blue-eyed Nordics that founded them, right? Perhaps the reason you fear immigration so much is that you're on some level aware of the white man's sordid history, and fear the same thing will be done to white people that white people did to others. I assure you, that's not the case.
I mean, who did they elect in their first democratic election? Surely they must have elected someone who liberated the country and proved many rights for blacks. No. Zimbabweans managed to elect a genocidal cockbag, aka Robert Mugabe. I mean, if that's not a case of extreme racism, then what does the word racism even mean?
And white nations never elected national embarrassments before. Oh, wait.
Let us delve into the crime rate of America.
And here comes the part of the video that makes this video the vile, festering pile of rancid garbage that sets it apart from run-of-the-mill right-wing stupidity like the previous videos I've covered so far, and pushes it in the direction of blatant Nazi propaganda. And please spare me that you call everyone you disagree with a Nazi that I know a lot of the alt-right likes to employ. You don't get to compare feminists to Nazis and complain that the word is being diluted.
Feminism. Now, the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men.
Nazi. A member of the National Socialist German Workers' Union.
About 13% of Americans are black, according to the estimates from the US Census Bureau. And yes, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, black offenders committed 52% of homicides. This was in data recorded between 1980 and 2008. Only 45% of the offenders were white. In 2013, the FBI reported that 38% of murders were committed by blacks. However, only 31.1% were committed by whites. In 29.1% of cases, the perpetrator's race was unknown. Over 3 years of data from 2011 to 2013, 38.5% of people arrested for murder, robbery, manslaughter, rape, and aggravated assault were black. This is evidence from official police reports that blacks are more likely to commit crimes than whites. And why is this? Is it the unfair justice system?
And society's unfair treatment of people of color on a conscious and subconscious level. Non-whites are more likely to live in densely packed urban areas, but any highly urbanized area will have a higher crime rate regardless of its demographics. Look at Wheeling, West Virginia, for example, a majority white city with a high crime rate. Boise, Idaho is another example, but has almost 1.5 times the crime rate as the rest of Idaho. Madison, Wisconsin is another example. I know that the exceptions don't prove the rule, but the point is, many large cities happen to have a very large African American population.
You guys like to say that, but it's not. In the book of IQ and the Wealth of Nations, it talks about the IQ of the average sub-Saharan African being at 80. The IQ of an African American is normally at 85. White populations in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Europe, South Africa, and the United States score really close to one another, being at around 100. The reason to why IQ is such an important factor is because a lower IQ causes many detrimental factors in society. These include poverty, dropping out of school, unemployment, divorce and lower rates of marriage, welfare dependency, a child's poor motor skills and development, and criminal behavior. So then, setting out these societal differences, which is backed by data, surely should be common sense, right? Think again, we are still expected to act as if these IQ differences do not exist at all.
And what do you think affects IQ? It's not an unbiased measure of intelligence or one's potential intelligence, but a factor of how well one is able to solve logic puzzles and regurgitate facts. If one's interest is nurtured, they will be more likely to succeed. The answer, of course, to what variables play a role in IQ is environmental factors. West Virginia has a lower IQ on average than the rest of the United States, for example, ranking it at 46th. Meanwhile, New Jersey, an ethnically diverse state, has the second highest national IQ average. Also, it should be worth noting that the authors of the book and their follow-up even admit that environment does play a factor, but the work has received a lot of criticism for incomplete data and the fact that it can be used to push for national policies.
Thus assuming that the societal problems occurring are not a genetic factor, but are blamed on white people as per usual. And if we highlight these slight differences, we are called racist and assholes. However, it is a fact that wherever black people are concentrated in large numbers in the West, they are likely to promote tribal situations, such as gangs, territories, and fights. But for some reason, it is still our fault as white people.
Because the Mafia, Irish street gangs like the Dead Rabbits, nativist wasp street gangs like the Bowery Boys, and motorcycle gangs don't exist, right? Or are you going to claim that Italians and Irish aren't really white? Or how about the Greaser street gangs of the 50s, which were mostly white? But that still leaves the aforementioned gangs and the Ku Klux Klan, who I'm sure you're quite fond of. And over in England in the 50s, there were the Teddy Boys, which in the 60s became mods and rockers. And if you want to talk tribalism, how about how many US cities were sharply divided among ethnic lines between Irish, German, English, Polish, Jewish, Italian, and many other groups until as recently as the 1960s in many places.
On average, densely populated black communities show a thirst for tribal mentality, as well as tribal warfare, because it is still white people to blame for a problem that is predominantly genetic.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Whites have given many resources to help black communities in the West and even in Africa. However, black communities on average remain unsuccessful in full integrations in civilized communities.
And of course you think that's genetic. You don't think it could possibly have anything to do with the fact that racist white assholes like yourself continue to other them and act uncomfortable at the idea of living around black people.
It might also be surprising that blacks have a higher self-esteem than whites on average. In one large study of 11 to 16-year-olds, blacks rated themselves as more attractive than did whites. Blacks also rated themselves higher in reading, social studies, and sciences, but funnily enough, not in mathematics.
What does having a higher self-esteem have to do with skin color? If it has anything to do with race, it's because it's a reaction to being told by society that black people aren't as good at intellectual pursuits and less like the white standard of beauty seen in Western movies. The more you remove the idea of one race being the gold standard or any expectations of failure, the better everyone does. But it's just a start. We of course need to address the environmental factors that go into it. Factors you like to pretend don't exist. Speaking of DNA, did you know that sub-Saharan Y chromosome DNA has been found in the majority of British people dating back to the Roman times? Yet, the sun never set on the British Empire at one time, and it led the world for a few centuries when it came to industry and military technology. Not bad for a nation that has DNA you deem incapable of creating great things.
This inferiority complex leads to the whole "we was kings and shit" debacle.
Fuck off with that racist bullshit, you bigoted piece of shit.
A lot of black people like to assume that they were Egyptian kings, which is funny because it doesn't help the whole slave thing. But nonetheless, they really weren't kings. Near to every single African slave that was brought from Africa to America came from mainly two countries in Africa, Senegambia and Angola. Both of these countries are on the west coast of Africa, and neither of these countries are anywhere near to Egypt.
Do you really believe that all African Americans are Hoteps? Despite what your brainwashing tells you, despite the fact that Egypt wasn't a sub-Saharan African country, there was no Nordic desert empire. It was not ruled by people with blonde hair and blue eyes.
Mitochondrial DNA proves this. Not to mention, a lot of African languages prove that black people lack abstract thinking. As I would like to mention, not all black people lack it. As I said, this is just an average. The English to Zulu language dictionary has only 250 pages. And like the other African Negro languages, it does not include a working definition of any abstract concepts.
Your own source for this, a white supremacist blog that clearly wouldn't have an agenda to push. No, these digital sophists aren't promoting some kind of ridiculous agenda at all. Second, Clancy does a great job of showing how your own source contradicted itself. Overall, it's a good video if you can look past the ideological axe to grind against SJWs, which these guys are contractually obligated to provide in every video. But I would like to add this. If you've ever seen African art, or African American art, or heard some of the musical innovations that black people have come up with, you would see just how weak and flimsy the black people can't do abstract thinking argument is. At this point, this video has gone so far beyond merely being a garden variety cacophony of preposterous, racist, unenlightened, fear-mongering bullshit, to something that seems designed to be as offensive as possible, merely for the sake of seeing how horrible the lurid, unhinged, detestable ramblings of a racist little shit who's addicted to outrage can possibly be. Congratulations politicians, you've approached Stormfront levels of disingenuous ramblings that has disgusted your own community so much that even the Kekistani frogs want nothing to do with you anymore. I'm sure you'll still have your loyal fan base, who fantasize about cheating on their anime body pillows with you. But the people who thought you were just a garden variety anti-SJW can no longer deny the truth, that you are an ignoramus with a penchant for bigotry, an addiction to outrage. Hence why you jumped from Tumblr straight to Stormfront. Although your "I used to be an SJW" could have meant that you were previously a liberal shitlord like Shiwon Head, someone you likely consider an SJW.
Because technically, it's not possible for them to think that way or those communities to have been thinking that way. Obviously, you can then argue why a lot of African Americans are then able to learn English. However, do you remember when I said that the average African American IQ is 15 points higher than that of the sub-Saharan Africans? That could be a reason why.
Or it could be that Western IQ tests are geared towards Westerners, and the fact that environmental conditions in the US are better than the war-torn nations that the poor oppressed white people subjugated and pillaged for centuries. In a few centuries, it's certainly possible that some, or all African nations, will pull far ahead of Europe and the Americas, and there will be some who say that Europeans having a lower IQ is because of white genetic inferiority. Of course, this is just one of many possibilities.
So again, whenever I'm talking about this, it's really important to remember that I am talking about an average. Anyway, that's enough from me.
Of all the videos I've responded to, this festering pile of dog shit is perhaps the worst. It's even worse than those Undoomed videos I responded to last year. RageAfterStorm is one of the few anti-SJWs which I can honestly say has no redeeming characteristics whatsoever. She has failed to demonstrate that she has any kind of standards beyond what happens to her personally. She's a lot like Edgy Sphinx, a racist piece of human garbage that infiltrated the skeptic community by making anti-SJW videos before pushing alt-right propaganda. It seems that the skeptic community is finally starting to get it. Edgy wasn't an anomaly. When they focus entirely on bashing feminism and social justice, they shouldn't be surprised to find some of the people that they share their views on feminism and social justice are going to be anti a whole lot of other things. Rather than stand up to the alt-right, these guys have treated them like allies, or not much of a threat, showing they fear Anita Sarkeesian much more than Richard Spencer, and their focus on bashing feminism allows these guys to sneak in alt-right propaganda. It's only when it becomes so obvious that it can't be ignored that the skeptic community finally admits that it's not just SJWs calling everyone Nazi. Just because they agree with Nazis on feminism and social justice doesn't mean they should buddy up with them. Forget your stupid culture war. Outside of YouTube, who really cares that some random cartoon animal made a response to some video to some random teenage girl with 80 subscribers?